Bom dia! Tudo bem? Muito bom. Vamos? Why we need the Kanban Maturity Model. And that's enough Portuguese for now. All right. I've been here for a week, and people who've been in my class have given me some recommendations about what I should talk about. So, what's the biggest impediment to successful Agile adoption in Brazil? This is the audience participation moment here. You are allowed to shout out your suggestions. Trust. Okay, lack of trust. Anyone else? All the people in my class are here at the front. They're all sitting there really quiet. And is that it? That's the only issue? So that's an impediment to Agile adoption? Why? How is that an impediment? In what way is it preventing you adopting Agile?
Sometimes you need to reduce the time to market and try to find ways to adopt some Agile.
Yeah, so that's a reason why it's not an impediment. Right. Lack of trust. Anything else?
It's guidance.
Hmm?
It's guidance.
What do you mean?
We don't have clear path to
So lack of guidance, lack of a clear path to actually getting there. In other words, the existing guidance in the market isn't good enough. Okay. Other reasons? Leadership. Lack of leadership. That's good. I like that. So far, I haven't had the number one answer that people have told me in the past week since I came to Brazil. Although leadership and trust are numbers 2 and 3 on the list. Right, so we've got 2 out of the top 3. Can somebody find the number 1 hit? Lack of motivation, some wishful thinking I heard at the beginning. What about company culture? How many of you think company culture is a major impediment to your Agile adoption? What, like 3 of you? Really? A little more enthusiasm here. How many of you think company culture is impeding your Agile adoption? All right, that's more than half. Good. We got to the right answer in the end. All right, so company culture, that's the first one. And which element of the culture has the biggest impact on wider adoption? I think we had trust and we had leadership. Any other suggestions? No? Or you're just tired from the commute this morning? Sorry, I didn't hear that. Silos. Siloed organization, right? That's good. But we're going to talk about trust. Now, first of all, let's talk about culture in general. Who works for IBM here? I'm sure there's 1 or 2 of you. All right, so you will at least know this gentleman, the former chairman, Lou Gerstner. And in his book, his memoir after he retired from the position as a chairman, although he is still on the board of directors, and some IBMers from New York tell me that he still shows up for work from time to time. I have no idea how old he is now, but admirable. Right, until I came to IBM, I probably would have told you that culture was just one among several elements in any organization's makeup and success. Now, before he came to IBM, he was the chief executive of Nabisco, a company that make breakfast cereals and cookies and food products generally. So he would be the chief executive, but now he's the chairman, he's the top guy. Along with vision, strategy, marketing, financials, and the like, this is what he thought his job used to be. I came to see in my time at IBM that culture isn't just one aspect of the game, it is the game. So in his opinion, his number one and really only job as the leader of the company was to help define its culture. That he was the chief culture hacker. Fixing culture is the most critical and the most difficult part of a corporate transformation. I think many of you here in Brazil see that. Rodrigo, we're having an issue with the microphone. In the end, management doesn't change the culture. Management invites the workforce itself to change the culture. All right, very good. So that's fine. And a lot of people who get on stages like this would just leave it like that and say, all right, so culture's important, just deal with it. But as Eduardo pointed out to me, there's a lack of good guidance in the market. The trouble that you're having is there's no pathway, there's no roadmap, there's no tools for dealing with these issues, except there are tools for dealing with these issues. All right, so how do we go about changing the culture? We have to understand that culture is made up of values and behaviors. So the values are the things we believe in, the principles that we hold to be important, and the behaviors are the decisions and actions, the things that we actually do, regardless of whether we're an individual contributor or the chairman of the company or anyone in between those levels. So what we want are explicitly defined values that everyone knows about, that they're shared, and then we want to be able to hold everybody in the company, regardless of their level on the pay scale, accountable that their decisions and actions are congruent with those values. Now, in 2008, when I started my company, my first significant client was BT in the United Kingdom. That's the former British Telecom, the second biggest business in the United Kingdom after BP. Apparently, we only do two-letter acronyms in the UK. So my sponsor there was a senior executive, and he was a direct report to the chief operating officer. And they were spending at the time a reasonable sum of money, 14 million British pounds, educating their UK-based software engineering workforce on extreme programming because they wanted to be an agile telecom company. That was a small part of their workforce. They employed at least 25,000 software engineers in India and perhaps more around the world in other locations. So they were investing in this agile transition, and the question they had for me was, as a senior executive, what could we be doing to help with the agile transition? How can we help make it happen? And this is the advice that I gave them. And now, I published this in 2009, and it's called the Agile Decision Filter. Right? That you should make progress with imperfect information rather than delaying and waiting for perfect information. Right? That you should take actions that encourage and maintain a high-trust culture, and you should treat work in progress as though it's a liability rather than an asset. In other words, this was the senior executive version of the Agile Manifesto, because the Agile Manifesto isn't a manifesto at all. It's a decision filter. It's a decision filter for individual contributors, team leads, supervisors, department managers, in order for them to make decisions that improve the agility of the organization. And this is the executive version. So if they're capable of introducing this filter and holding their own decisions and actions accountable against it, and then percolating down through every level of the management, from the senior executive's shop floor, you will create a culture that enables agile methods to be more successful. Now, a year earlier, 2007, I had co-authored an academic paper with a couple of guys called Merwin Mehta and David Raffel. It's become quite a famous paper, the most cited paper in lean software development. And at that time, in 2007, it was 2008, I think it was the most downloaded paper from the Wiley academic website. And a couple of years ago, I got an award for it as the most influential paper in lean or agile development published in the previous decade. Anyway, in that paper, it contains not this filter, but the advice behind it. And the first two on this list, they came from my co-author, Merwin Mehta. Value trumps flow. In other words, we will expedite something at the expense of flow if it maximizes the value that we make. Flow trumps waste elimination, because people think lean's all about waste elimination, and no, it really isn't. And waste elimination trumps economy of scale. So rather than pursue big batch sizes, which was a traditional management approach in 20th century Western businesses, physical businesses, manufacturing, distribution, and so forth, it's better to eliminate waste and do things in small batches. Make small batch sizes efficient. That's essentially what Toyota had done with their Toyota production system. So with these three filters, you can ensure that the operational management of a company are making good decisions that are compatible with lean objectives on a day-to-day basis. So we've got an agile decision filter, we've got a lean decision filter, it's only 6 bullet points. Do you think your senior executives can remember 6 bullet points? Hopefully. Particularly as it's 2 groups of 3. If it was one list of 6, they might struggle with that. But 2 3s, they're probably okay with it. All right, let's talk about trust for a little bit now. This is an extract of a 2007 presentation that actually lasted a whole hour on itself, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. Now, sociologists, they call trust social capital. And they've been measuring it for many years. And one of the very simplest ways they measure it is, do you trust, for example, if you're from the United States, your fellow Americans? And if you're from the Netherlands, which is usually used as the benchmark high trust country in the world, do you trust your fellow Dutch people? So do you trust your fellow Brazilians? It's a question. And from the chuckles, I will say probably not. Now, I've been coming to Brazil for 11 years now, and I've asked this question of audiences and people in classes over the years, so I have a fairly good idea. Also, sociologists do study this. They ask Brazilians, do you trust your fellow Brazilians? We'll get to that in a moment. Do you trust your fellow Brazilians who live in the same, who work at the same company you work at, work in your office? Yes, you do, largely, right? You're mostly nodding. And that's because they've got a university education, they've been through a rigorous selection process, maybe you've done some background checks on them, and you work with them on a day-to-day basis. You trust the people who work in your office. Do you trust the people who live in the same condominium that you live in? Not so much. Because the entrance criteria for your condominium was that they had enough money to buy the apartment. And you don't know where that money came from. So you trust people you work with more than the people you live with inside your little barbed wire fenced security guard fortress of a condominium. And while you're leaving your condominium parking and driving to your office parking, so driving along in your car through the rest of Brazil, you don't trust those other Brazilians out there. So there's like 3 levels. There's the people I work with, the people I live with in the same condominium, not so much, and the rest of the people, no, definitely no. Right, so the figure in Latin America, and so back here to the United States, this is 15-year-old data, but it's only 24% of Americans. Now, before this gentleman here was the president, Tricky Dicky Nixon, the answer was 70%. The Nixon presidency is widely regarded as the pivotal point in United States culture that sent the trust level going down. Because when your president isn't trustworthy, it signals to everyone else it's okay not to be trustworthy. Now, in Latin America and Africa, the number's very low, single figures. A picture of a favela here, I'm sure that you recognize the type of scene. Right. So if you've got a low trust environment, and I'm going to ask, how many of you consider that you work in a low trust environment, that your company, you might trust the people, but generally, do the managers trust you? How many of you work in a low trust environment? And all the people at my class should have their hands up, right? Right, so if you work in a low trust environment, and trust is a major impediment to the successful Agile adoption, you need to know how to fix it. That seems reasonable. Have you ever had any advice and guidance on how to fix the trust in your company? All right, time for some of that, right? So how do we go about building a trust relationship, or particularly a broken trust relationship? Some of you will recognize here President Jimmy Carter and President Brezhnev. This is from the Strategic Arms Limitation talks in the 1970s, because at some point they figured out we've probably got enough nuclear weapons and we could stop now. So these two sides don't trust each other. It was the Cold War, and now they have to do something about it. And the famous phrase, trust but verify, came out from these talks. Now, humans naturally want to reciprocate trust. We're just wired that way. We naturally trust. We actually learn to not trust. And therefore, to begin to build trust, it actually requires an act of trusting. The way that you become trustworthy is to go about trusting other people. Now, if you've got a broken relationship, bad trust, apologizing definitely helps, but really there needs to be an act of humility. And often when there's a broken trust relationship, when the person who broke the trust comes back to the other person, wants to apologize, the other person will want to ritually humiliate them if they're not showing enough humility to start with. So defensiveness does not repair a broken trust relationship. If you're not good at delivering and your customer's unhappy with you, defensiveness and excuses aren't going to help. You need to take ownership of the failure. You need to own the fact that you're not good at delivery, even if you think it's their fault. Vulnerability disarms. So I'm sure you've all seen these scenes in movies, from history, where two sides are about to fight a battle and they've lined up their armies on either side of the battlefield. And they'd sort of kind of not like to fight the battle because people are going to die, it's going to have an impact on their economies, and one side might actually lose, and that could be bad for the side that loses. So they'd like to have last-minute peace talks. And what will typically happen is a small delegation from either side will ride out into the middle of the battlefield. Maybe not the king, but perhaps the crown prince or some other high-ranking person from the army with one or two assistants. So they're going to ride out in their horse to the middle of the battlefield, and they've got a choice when they're doing that. They can carry their spear or they can carry their shield. So the shield on the horse or the spear on the horse. Which one do you bring with you to the peace talks in the middle of the battlefield before the battle commences? Do you put down your shield and carry your spear, or do you put down your spear and carry your shield? How many of you think you bring the shield to the middle of the battlefield? A few. How many think you bring the spear? A few more. The rest of you are afraid to give the answer. This shows a fundamental lack of trust here. All right, the answer is that you drop your shield. You bring the spear with you. The spear indicates that you're still potent, but you are vulnerable. And by indicating vulnerability, you show the other side that you trust them. Now, that could turn out to be foolish, and you might get killed, in which case the battle will happen. But the battle would have happened anyway. It's just that you sacrificed the crown prince or one of the generals of the army in order to test that hypothesis. All right, so vulnerability is disarming. It is a way to go about building trust and repairing broken trust relationships. In other words, you need to let people in. You need to let people see what you're doing. You need to have some transparency. And in our world, that means stuff like this, and reporting and metrics, and just generally letting people form some empathy for your situation. Enable empathy forming through transparency. Trust is also event-driven. We don't have time to get into the neuropsychology of what actually makes your brain trust someone or something, but the neurotransmitter for it is something called oxytocin. And every time you experience a trustworthy act, you get a little hit of oxytocin. And the more of those hits you get, the more frequently it happens, the more you trust. One big dose of oxytocin isn't as powerful as lots of little doses frequently. So trust is event-driven. So define small goals you can achieve and commit to them and deliver. And accuracy is more important than precision. You've been working late, the weather's bad, the traffic's terrible, you're now stuck in traffic on the way home, and there's a danger that your dinner is going to be inside the dog. And you get on your phone to say, honey, I'm going to be late. And she said, oh, that's okay, I understand, it's bad weather, traffic's probably terrible. What time will you be home? How do you answer that question? With precision or accuracy? They're not the same thing, right? Now, if you give an accurate answer like, oh, not before 8 p.m., and you arrive home at 8:20, that was a trustworthy thing. If you say, well, I think I'll be home at 8:05, and you don't get home until 8:20, you broke a promise. Same outcome, one's a trustworthy act and the other one isn't. Learn to set expectations so you can deliver on your promises. That's why service level agreements in Kanban work better than giving precise delivery dates. You give a precise delivery date and you don't hit it, you broke a promise, you're untrustworthy. You give an SLA with some perhaps expectation that you can hit it 85 or 90% of the time, and you do that, you have a trustworthy service. You are trustworthy. It completely changes the relationship with your customer. Deliver commitments regularly at the personal level, sort of every day is good, right? At a team level, perhaps weekly is good. And you want to be able to do things on a regular cadence. If you make a delivery to your customer every Wednesday in the afternoon, and you do it every single Wednesday in the afternoon, that's trustworthy. You don't necessarily promise precisely what's in the delivery. Right, small commitments delivered often build trust better than one large commitment delivered infrequently. So there's a virtuous cycle here. Agile style of working builds trust, but you need trust in order to have an agile style of working. So you need to work at it slowly. You need to start with a bit of transparency, a bit of humility. You need to take ownership of things. You need to show responsibility, and you need to make promises you can keep by pursuing accuracy rather than precision. Break down barriers between job functions, get people to work more collaboratively. Collaborate by introducing games, although be careful with gamification because it can create nasty side effects. Demonstrate competence. If you have demonstrable competence at what you do for a living, you're a trustworthy person. Trust's a lot to do with predictability. So if you're good at what you do, therefore the outcome is predictable, you're trustworthy. Create values and principles and make them explicit. This is actually the Constitution of the United States here. And then once you've got your explicit values and principles, hold people accountable to them. Ensure that their actions and their decisions are congruent. Let your values guide your decision-making and your organizational structure. Flatten the organization. Flatter organizations generally higher trust environments. Empower people. But define boundaries of responsibility so that people feel safe with their empowerment, so that they know the boundary of what they're empowered to do and decide, because if they've acted inside those boundaries, they should feel safe. They're not going to get punished for any actions. And practice failure tolerance. Recognize that you empower people. They're not always as experienced as you are. And from time to time, they will make mistakes. But if you punish people for those mistakes, they won't feel empowered and they'll stop behaving that way. Encourage learning from failure. The reason that the commercial airline industry is so trustworthy is because they do this. They learn from failure and they figure out what went wrong and they prevent it happening again. But what happens if someone steps outside the boundary of their empowerment? They misbehave. Well, the correct answer here is that you have to take the misbehavior, the miscreant, and you have to punish them in some way. You have to bench them, put them in the sin bin for a while. If whatever they did was particularly bad, you have to fire them. But if it's not bad, you just put them in the penalty box for a while. And then when they re-emerge from that punishment, you micromanage them until they're trustworthy again. You don't, for example, punish everyone in your business unit just because one person transgressed. There's a real story behind these slides, but I don't have time to tell it. The people in my class at the front here, they all know the story. Right, create decision frameworks. In other words, teach people how to make decisions. If you have those decision filters like I showed you, or some of the risk assessment framework that we teach, then if you ask people to use those and they demonstrate they are using them, you've got some confidence they're making good quality decisions. They're taking good actions. They're trustworthy. And demonstrate management competence by aligning the work and the strategy with your values and principles, your corporate goals. Make all of that transparent. Congruence, the fact that what you do matches what you said, is very important for building trust. It makes you a predictable, trustworthy person, whether you're the chairman of the company or whether you're an individual contributor. Right? Use transparency to show how to tactical, operational, and strategic goals in the organization. So in Kanban, things like our operations review, the service delivery review, the other feedback mechanisms, they are designed to provide this level of transparency and demonstrate the congruence. People will trust in your reputation for delivering results. When I first put this section of the talk together, this gentleman here was retired. And I speculated at the time, if you were forming a new Formula One team, would you hire him to drive the car? 2 years later, that's exactly what Mercedes did. Right, so how does the Kanban maturity help you address these cultural issues and build trust? Because we really do feel the Kanban maturity model is a major step forward in solving these issues that you're struggling with here in your Brazilian companies, these cultural and trust issues. All right, so what is the Kanban maturity model? Now you'll notice that we have this graphic. It's been since we launched the 1.0, and it says culture, practices, and outcomes through managed evolution. In other words, we designed it to solve these problems because we recognized just telling you what to do in terms of Agile processes, that's not working. We need to give you advice on actually how to run your companies, how to lead. We need to give you advice on how to develop leaders to be better and to get them to recognize that their job is to create a culture so that you can be successful. All right, so the Kanban maturity model maps practices from the method onto 7 levels of organizational maturity. Now, we've talked about this at previous conferences. The last time I was here, we had the second beta release. So now we've got, actually it's release 1.1, 1 year later. And this is the picture of it here. Now you'll notice that trust gets its own first-class thing with low maturity is low trust and high maturity is high trust. And actually to get from level 0 to level 6, we actually have to drive more trust into the organization. Did we give this poster out? Yes, so you all got the poster and in Portuguese. Fantastic. You'll find it in the bag. So we've got 7 levels called oblivious, team-focused, customer-driven, fit for purpose, very hard to translate into Portuguese. Risk-hedged, market leader, and built for survival, also hard to translate into Portuguese. And it's from level 0 to 6, and we'll talk about what do those mean, right? Level 0, the organization is oblivious to the need for any organization. It's just a loosely affiliated collection of individuals. And they're doing it their own way. And every customer has their pet. It's a world where someone in the business lifts up the phone, calls a guy in the IT department and says, hey, can I have a few web pages, please? And the person says, sure, I know how to make web pages. There's no governance, there's no controls. And I've heard real examples of that from companies here in Brazil. Some of you probably know Pablo Emanuel. He has a story like that, where he joined a company where that was the level of maturity. Someone in the business just picked the phone up, called their favorite IT guy and asked for something. Do any of you work in companies like that? There's a few nods. Okay, so we have a few maturity level 0 organizations in the room. That proves it really exists. We didn't just make this up. Right? Right, level 1 is team focused. Now what that means is never the same way twice. That we have an emergent process. Maybe that's a polite way of saying it, but the reality is that whoever's working today, whichever shift might be on, or whoever has shown up for work, the process is different. And consequently, what the customer experiences is a lot of variability. A lot of variability in the outcome. And individual heroics and unconnected teams. So this is the siloed problem. And a lot of individual heroics. And you know that you work in a maturity level 1 company if your company runs job adverts that say, Ninja developer needed for dynamic environment. Right? In other words, you've institutionalized the recruitment of heroes because you don't have the organizational maturity and discipline to operate successfully without them. Right. Maturity level 2, customer driven. There's now some recognition we actually have a customer. The reason we show up to work is to serve that customer. But we're not really very good at it yet. We know the customer exists, and we know we have to collaborate with some other teams in order to deliver what the customer needs. So we now have a defined process. We're able to draw a Kanban board with multiple columns on it showing how the different teams collaborate, but the result isn't very consistent. So we've got consistency of process, but inconsistent outcomes. But it's still significantly better than level 1 if you're the customer watching from the outside. That's still untrustworthy, but way better than it used to be. That's the way the customer would describe it. And now we've got managerial heroics, because if the customer's in a hurry for something, we need to expedite that request across the Kanban board between the different siloed teams. And to get that done requires a manager going around cracking a whip. There's still a lot of delays and there's last-minute tension, and despite of the fact we have some coordination. Right, level 3 is fit for purpose. This means that we now deliver on customer promises regularly enough that no one's really complaining. Happy customers. And the thing here is that we have consistency of process and we have consistency of outcome, and consequently, we don't need heroes anymore. Now, if you've matured to this level, and you've gone through 0, 1, and 2 to get there, how do the heroes on your workforce feel about getting to level 3? They're not happy. Exactly. Because they took a great pride in being the hero. So actually, the heroes become an impediment to getting to level 3. They don't want you to successfully deliver to customers unless they had a personal hand in making it happen. And that means that some of the heroes might need to leave the company as you mature to level 3. And they might be some of your favorite people. And they might be the people who, at least historically, have been given the best annual reviews and the bonuses because you've been rewarding heroes. When I worked at Microsoft, the general manager of our business unit gave out Programmer of the Month award to the programmer who had fixed the most bugs. There was no prize for not creating bugs in the first place. All right, level 4 is risk hedged. And this means that we're not just keeping the customers happy, all of the stakeholders are happy. And that there's no more surprises. Whether it's from a customer expectation perspective or an economic perspective or a regulatory perspective, we keep everybody happy. And this is difficult to do. You have to be able to achieve a balance between customer satisfaction and economic results and regulatory compliance. This takes some maturity in the leadership. Number 5 is market leader. Now, not every company needs to aspire to this, because market leader means simply the best. It's the pursuit of perfection. And it's the focusing on marginal gains and attention to every detail in order to achieve it. This is the language you hear from Formula One teams and bicycle racing teams and other professional athletes, because often the difference between the gold medal and the silver medal is a split second, right? It's a narrow margin. And finally, built for survival. This is about reinvention, about redefining the purpose of the business and the identity of the business, about recognizing that from time to time, the environment around us changes and the business we're operating is less relevant than it used to be, and we need to reinvent it. Lou Gerstner reinvented IBM as a professional services company when previously they were a mainframe manufacturer. All right, so the key here is to realize it's the organization that matures. It's not the Kanban that's maturing. The Kanban Maturity Model's a misnomer. It should really be called the Kanban mapping for the organizational maturity model. But if the book was called that, none of you would have bought the book. So that is actually the old graphic. Well, maybe not, yeah. Now, when the organization's under stress, the different things happen at different maturity levels. The lower the maturity level, the less stress it's capable of absorbing. You stress a low maturity company and things get worse. You stress a higher maturity company, level 4, 5, or 6, and they respond to that by getting better. The photograph a little earlier of the Indonesian gentleman inspecting the wreck of the aircraft that had crashed, that's the airline industry getting better. And you think a plane fell out of the sky, hundreds of people died, that was stress. That stresses the whole industry because it undermines confidence for all of us. So they respond to that by getting better, right? So high maturity organizations, they follow procedure and they improve when you stress them. A low maturity organization panics and regresses. So one of the ways you know if you're in a low maturity organization is ask yourself, the last time something went wrong around here, what happened next? Did people panic, run around like headless chickens, and then miraculously a hero emerged to save the day and fix the problem, get us back on track? Or did we follow procedure and figure out how to improve? I'm going to skip this stuff on leadership maturity in the interests of time. The Kanban maturity model exists to drive appropriate application of Kanban practices. The reason is that many Kanban practices are too stressful for your organization right now. So we've recognized two failure modes in Kanban introduction. The first one is overreaching. This is because you've hired one of these smart people who sit at the front here who've been in my training, and they've read all the books, they've watched all the conference videos, they know everything. And consequently, they're enthusiastic to show you everything they know, the smartest guy in the room. And they design a Kanban system which is very elaborate to show off how much they know, but it's too difficult for you to adopt. And your organization chokes on it and spits it out and says, you know, everything was better around here before we adopted this Kanban thing, stupid sticky notes on the wall. Let's not do that anymore. The other problem is the false summit plateau problem. We've done Kanban and it was great. You know these people, the people around Brazil with their sticky notes on the wall. who tell you that they're already doing Kanban. So we need to encourage those people to realize that that's a good start, but you could take it further. Now, an analogy that I've used is you see some kids in the street and they've put some t-shirts down to make goals and they're kicking a football around. And if you ask them, what are you doing? They'll say, we are playing football. Now, how about you turn up at the Bernabeu Stadium in Madrid and there's a bunch of guys running around in white uniforms there and you ask them, what are you doing? And they'll say, we're playing football. Do you think there's a difference? Kids in the street, Real Madrid, right? There's a maturity model for playing football. And there's a maturity model for playing Kanban. People are still doing it if they're at the level of the kids kicking the ball around in the street. But if they're really serious about their football, there's a whole lot more that they could be doing. All right. So a Kanban maturity model prevents both of these failure modes. And it does that by mapping more than 150 practices against the different levels. So if you can figure out over at level 1, you can take a look at the practices for level 2 and then choose some of them and introduce them in the environment and see if they cause just a little bit of stress. Because if you're going to make things better, you need a little stress, but not too much. Right, there's no such thing as bad Kanban, just inappropriate practice selection. This is a derivative of a Northern European saying that there's no such thing as bad weather, only inappropriate clothing. So the Kanban maturity model illustrates appropriate practice adoption for different levels. And we've developed this over a decade from observing real case studies and real companies and client engagements. We didn't just think this up as a thought experiment. Now, level 3 is called fit for purpose. And what would a fit for purpose organization look like? Well, it's one that continually satisfies its customers with products and services designed, implemented, and delivered in a sustainable manner. You can do this all the time, regularly. And we've got the Fit for Purpose framework, and maybe there's some people presenting on this at the conference there was last year in order to help with this understanding. And therefore, the Fit for Purpose framework integrates nicely to the Kanban maturity model. If we were to look at the model of the 7 layers, level 0 through 2 is unfit for purpose because your customer thinks you suck. Level 3 is currently fit for purpose because our observation is that level 3 might not be sustainable. You could be delivering wonderful customer service and losing money every time you do it. How long are you willing to keep losing money? Now, when the money runs out, that's stressful. How's your company going to behave under that stress as the money runs out? The likelihood is that they'll regress back to level 2. So you really want long-term sustainability, you have to achieve level 4. Therefore, our goal is that we have to be able to create level 4 organizations. Most of you here are working in a level 0 or 1 organization, 1 or 2 of you in level 2. We've all got some work to do here. There was a hand up. You think you're in a level 4 organization? No? Maybe? That would be good. We'll get you on the stage next year. All right, so we believe that if you want the changes to stick, if you want improvement to really work, we have to do it in an evolutionary, incremental fashion because revolutionary changes are inherently fragile. And this sort of thing, this happened with a Kanban trainer in London. His client came up to him and said, Jose, we think we're level 2. This is code for, we're really level 1, but we're not comfortable admitting it. And they've heard the description of level 4, this long-term sustainable, beautifully balanced, risk-hedged, every stakeholder is happy. Nirvana. Oh, we'd love a bit of level 4. Take us there. And traditionally, we would design some managed change initiative and we would try to transition to level 4 immediately. That's not going to work. You're going to fail doing that. Because you start making the initiative, things get worse for a while. And what's likely to happen is that the organization gets unhappy with how bad they got or impatient with how long it's taking, and they fire the change agent. That's you. You take the blame. Or you can hire a censor, because their role in life is to take the blame. They get fired when the failure happens. Right? Or you can pursue Kanban, right? Evolutionary incremental change. And this is the counterintuitive bit. You're going to get to the result you desire faster with an evolutionary incremental change. Now here's some evolution in action. Cover from the Kanban book. Now what we've got here is a team in front of their board, and you can tell that there's a bit of stress in their environment. I'm stuck, I'm too busy, I'm idle. And then the fourth character who responds to that stress by saying, let's do something about it. And this is the magic formula for evolutionary change. There must be a stressor, there must be a reflection mechanism, and there must be leadership. Without all three of these, things don't get better. Now, the Kanban method actually codifies these things, right? We codify the reflection mechanisms as the Kanban cadences, and there are lots of practices that can be introduced in order to inject stress. And on the Kanban Maturity Model, those practices are in the transition sub-levels. So maturity level 1, 2, 3, 4, they have sub-level called transition, maturity level 1, transition, 2, transition, and so on. They have the stressors. And leadership can happen by example, by inspiration, by signaling, and by direction. So here's an example. This is from the Invictus movie, but what we have here, the characters in real life are Nelson Mandela and Francois Pienaar. So Nelson Mandela, the president of South Africa, and Francois Pienaar, the captain of their rugby team. And Mandela wants to find out if Pienaar's any good at leadership. So he invites him for a cup of tea at the presidential palace. And he asks him, what's your approach to leadership? And Pienaar replies, by example, always by example. And Mandela replies and said, example, that's always very good, but sometimes it is not enough. Sometimes you need to inspire people to a level of performance they did not know they were capable of. Now, Mandela was inspired by a poem called Invictus, the last two lines of which are, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. And he hand-wrote this poem on presidential notepaper, and he had it delivered to Pienaar's hotel room before a big game. Do you think that's inspirational? Handwritten letter from the president? This is Prince Harry. He created something called the Invictus Games. It's an Olympic Games for military personnel who've been disabled in the line of duty. And I'm sure it's not an accident why he called it the Invictus Games. So he's leading by example. He's a former military officer, and he's inspiring people. And this is from his keynote at the closing of the recent Invictus Games, where he said to all the athletes, you are inspirational to everyone, and not just because you've overcome your disability, but because you overcame the mental health challenges that came with that disability. And this is Prince Harry signaling something. What he's really signaling here, getting engaged to Meghan Markle some years ago, is that this little chap here, Prince George, directly in line to the throne, his nephew, the eldest son of Prince William. Prince George is going to be allowed to marry whoever the heck he likes, because Meghan Markle is a divorced American. And the last time a member of Harry's family tried to marry a divorced American, he had to give up the throne and pass it over to his brother, who was Harry's great-grandfather. So this is signaling significant change in the British royal family. Now, we've codified all this stuff into the maturity model. And we've built this thing called the evolutionary change model, which splits into the transition practices and the consolidation practices at every level. The outcome of which is that you use, a lot of clicks here, sorry. You use the transition practices to create the stress until people come and say, hey, this is a bit stressful. Can you help us do something about it? They're requesting some act of leadership, and then you consolidate by introducing the other practices, and you get to the next level, and then you repeat, and you repeat, and you repeat. So Eduardo said earlier that there's a lack of a roadmap. Well, not anymore. We've provided that roadmap for you. Using the Kanban Maturity Model to drive positive cultural change by following this roadmap. And we've mapped all the cultural values we think you need in order to get there. There's quite a lot of them. There's 30 altogether. So we don't expect you to remember any of them because there's so many. But if you can recognize where you are and figure out the 2 or 3 next cultural elements that are holding you back, then you can develop a decision filter. So let's say, for example, that we need leadership at all levels in our company if we're really going to embrace empowerment and move quickly, move with agility. Well, how about this as a decision filter for that? If you can do something about it, just do it. Act rather than ask permission, and it's better to try, even if you fail, than not to have made an attempt. Famous ice hockey player called Wayne Gretzky famously said, "You miss all the shots that you never took." Right, so you take these little bullet points and you teach the leadership to remember them and use them and hold themselves congruent, hold their decisions and actions congruent to it. And the consequence ought to be that the culture changes to enable the practices to get you to the next level. You do this incrementally, and eventually this will become second nature. People won't think about it anymore. Then you can move on to some of those other values. Don't let the fact that there's 30 on the list intimidate you. All right, so a decision filter for every cultural value deepens the organizational maturity. We change the culture by teaching leaders to use decision filters and holding them accountable for their decisions and actions. Right. And Kanban helps build trust in the following ways, right? You saw what it needs to build. You build trust at the beginning, and Kanban has explicit values, it has explicit policies and boundaries of empowerment. There's transparency, collaboration, there's predictability, promises kept. We teach you how to be fit for purpose, measurable capability, demonstrable competence, because you can reflect how you're doing against the model. And at the deeper levels, learning from failure and tolerance of failure. Kanban Maturity Model and the Kanban Method help you really significantly to build trust in your organization. So we've got the mechanisms for driving cultural change, and we've got the mechanisms for building trust. In other words, we've codified the core things you need to do in order to build large-scale agile organizations. All right? The Kanban Maturity Model is your path to a fit-for-purpose Agile organization. And with that, thank you all very much.